we, on opening government, are proud to support this motion that this House believes that China ought to increase pressure on North Korea. How do we believe that this should look like? Here's our models, here are our definitions. So we believe that China should be increasing sanctions and cutting off diplomatic ties against North Korea, unless North Korea starts taking actions to reduce their nuclear military program and stops overtly threatening South Korea any chance that they get. We believe that these are reasonable goals for China's actions, for why China is going to be increasing pressure on North Korea. I'll ask for clarifications about the model in a second, but I think it's pretty clear. It's going to be economic sanctions that China is going to be placing on North Korea. So we bring to you 4 points of matter today. First, why is it important that North Korea is tamed? Secondly, the fact that North Korea will only be listening to China. Thirdly, the fact that China wants to avoid a military conflict with the United States. And finally, that China is going to get more goodwill. We believe that this House is the global community, but we believe that we specifically need to look to the interests of China when deciding this motion, because it's going to be China that's going to be taking these actions. And we believe that the framework you should be judging this round on is ultimately who's going to be best at avoiding future conflict. Are there any clarifications at this time? All right, great. I'm going to move on. All right, first, North Korea is a bad actor. It is an actor that the global community and China wants to have tamed. Now, why is North Korea bad? Well, we all know about the human rights violations, concentration camps, starving people in North Korea, the fact that the North Korean government is an absolute dictatorship that does absolutely nothing to benefit the people who live there, who have been suffering through famine for decades. We know that these human rights violations are inherently a moral problem that the global community needs to be addressing. Why? Because these human rights violations harm human dignity, and that is something that we should not be standing for as a global community. But even on a more practical level, the other problem with North Korea's actions most recently is nuclear proliferation. They have been increasing their capacity for their uranium reactors. They've been increasing their ability to build hydrogen bombs. Essentially, they are developing weapons of mass destruction that could cause huge problems if North Korea were ever drawn into a conflict. And my partner will tell you that if they aren't tamed soon, there is a huge likelihood of that. I'll take your point.
Maybe she could do me a favor and you could justify your standard of caring about China more than A, the rest of the world, and B, the thousands of people starving inside North Korea.
Okay, so
your actions will hurt these people.
All right, we'll talk. Okay, we'll talk about that. No, we don't believe. So we're not saying that China needs to be considered more than anyone else. We just want to look specifically through the lens of China when talking about today's motion, because China is doing the actions. But yeah, global community is what matters, and we believe we're ultimately going to be affecting positive change in North Korea in the long run on our side of the house. So secondly, we know that North Korea will only listen to China. Why? Because the rest of the global community has sanctioned them, doesn't have diplomatic ties with them, has no relationship with them. Their only lifeline to the international community as a whole is China. They are almost entirely dependent on China and the fact that China turns the other way when North Korea does something bad, something like nuclear aggression, something like starving their people. Along those lines, China is North Korea's only ally. So we know that no other actor will be able to be as effective in taming North Korea's bad behavior as China will be. So that's something that we have to consider. That's why we have to look at this motion through the lens of China, but also through the lens of the entire global community. We know that there isn't any other practical way to affect any change because North Korea already is extremely isolated. So we know that there's no other country, the UN, no one else will be able to do anything. It's going to have to be China. Okay, but why is it in China's best interest to try to tame North Korea's nuclear ambitions? Well, the reason for this is our third point, that China does not want a military conflict with the United States. Now, why might there be a military conflict with the US? Well, North Korea is developing these nuclear weapons because they specifically want to attack South Korea, their next-door neighbor, right? So here's what the problem is. If North Korea decides to attack South Korea, then the United States, which has a defense agreement with South Korea and with many countries in Asia actually, is going to have to get involved in the conflict. Now, why is this a problem? Well, of course it's going to hurt the US to be in a war with China, considering how many of our how many things we import come from China. But it's also going to hurt China. Why? Because China is primarily a manufacturing-based economy. What does this mean? It means that they make goods that they have to sell to countries that are not manufacturing-based, that are service-based, like the United States. If China does not have a trading partner in the U.S., which would happen in the event of a war where China is going to have to side with North Korea and the U.S. is going to have to side with South Korea, then China's the goods that China creates are not going to be able to sold to one of the world's largest markets. Why is this? Because the people within China themselves are too poor to be able to afford most of the goods that China creates. However, a service sector economy like the U.S., which has millions of dollars to be able to spend on this, can. So what happens when China and the U.S. end up in some type of military conflict, which will happen if North Korea and South Korea end up fighting because of these nuclear aggressions, is the fact that China's economy is going to collapse, not to mention the rest of the world as a whole when these two big superpowers are in a fight. So we see that that affects the global community, but also specifically affects China. So why is it in China's best interest then, besides this desire to avoid conflict, to want to be able to take this action and to want to put pressure on North Korea, even if you don't buy this, like this conflict might be imminent, although my partner will be telling you about why it is. So the reason for this is because China is going to get more goodwill in the region that they're already in. Why is this? Well, nobody else in the world really likes North Korea, but specifically in Asia, nobody else in Asia really likes North Korea either. Why? Because North Korea is unstable, it's irrational, no one can ever be sure what actions they're going to be taking next. They don't want North Korea to have this power. However, China has just been letting them get away with it because China is the only country that might be able to control them. So what we see is that if China takes an action that's in line with the interests of what the Asian region as a whole wants, they're going to be able to have more allies within Asia, which is in China's best interest and also in the best interest of these other countries that want to promote trade, that want more economic development from China, the major regional actor in that area. Another group that is going to get more goodwill from is the UN. Right now, China has a seat on the Security Council, and that is what's been preventing the UN from really being able to take serious action against anything North Korea does. However, if China complies with what the UN wants, it's going to be able to get more legitimacy in that organization. It's also going to be able to create more allies for China because now they're not constantly contradicting everything that the West wants, especially when it's something like North Korea, a situation that has been going on for decades that the UN hasn't been able to address. So we see in that case, they're also going to get more goodwill in that respect. And we see that when China has better relationships with the rest of the world, that improves China, but that also improves these other countries that want to be able to trade with China, that want better relations with one of the biggest countries, with the biggest country on the planet, the country that will have the biggest economy in the world soon. So what we see is that ultimately China, by taking this action, will be able to open a lot of doors to them that they wouldn't have opened otherwise, and will finally be able to tamp down on North Korea's unacceptable behavior, and that's why we're proud to propose.
Thanks for that fine speech. Now call the leader of opposition to your speech for proceeding 7 minutes.
Considering the circumstances North Korea finds itself in right now, it becomes clear that the state is about as able to take a hit as Peyton Manning. So when we consider the nature of the North Korean people and the starvation that continues to rack the country, the procedure put forward by the government team not only won't solve, but will push North Korea to greater desperation and further entrench the desperate state of its people. So before I get to my positive matter, in which I'll first discuss the desperation of the North Korean people and how this will just lead to the rally to the flag mentality, and secondly, the idea that China has ulterior motives and isn't the best actor, we're going to start by looking at a little bit of rebuttal. So, first of all, she gets up here and talks about this model wherein they're increasing sanctions and diplomacy. They don't say specifically what they're sanctioning or what the diplomacy will look like. When we look to what China's doing with North Korea right now, obviously they're supplying their food, right? It's really the big chunk of it. We'll talk about that in a second, but 3 reasons why sanctions won't work here, right? First of all, it's because sanctions historically only hit the leaders, right? So, or don't hit the leaders, rather. So sanctions affect almost exclusively the people of a country. Obviously, North Korea's people have no ability to affect any sort of change whatsoever upon their government. Number 2, the black market will allow the things to get into North Korea that the government needs. This is things like weapons or uranium or whatever. They have a great trading agreement with, that continues to perpetuate with Iran, like the Nadang and Shabab missiles are very similar, suggesting the fact they continue to trade weapons, so they're not going to stop the government getting those sort of things. Number 3, historically, sanctions don't work. Iran's another great example of like the best progress we made with Iran is by loosening sanctions, not by tightening them. You could look to like Zaire under Mobutu, how he continued to build palaces in the jungle and hang out fat and happy, while the rest of the world just continued to implement more sanctions upon his country. So they don't work. That's 3 reasons not to do sanctions. Alright, her first point, why is this important? They're a bad actor, they have nukes, we totally agree. We hate the North Korean government. We think we have a better method for solving. Number 2, they say that China is the only lifeline for North Korea. We say that is absolutely true. China is responsible for the day-to-day survival of over a third of the North Korean populace, meaning that if a shipment of food doesn't arrive from China, this is literally like hundreds of thousands of deaths that occur very, very quickly. So again, it's the food that's coming from China that's supporting North Korea, and we're assuming that any sort of sanctions would affect that food, because that is by far the biggest bargaining chip that China has. We've already pointed out the North Korean government is going to get things like weapons from other sources, but they cannot get food elsewhere on the scale that China provides it. So that's where they're going to have to do those sanctions if they want to get any sort of impact, and that's going to hurt the people quite a lot. We'll talk about that more in a second. Number 3, she talks about how China wants no military conflict with the United States. We say this is true, but China is uniquely opposed to the United States, or at least the United States allies in the South China Sea. So to say that they don't want this military conflict doesn't really summarize the entire situation, because they're looking for a lot of hard power in the region, and if this means clashing with countries like Japan and South Korea, China has proven that it's willing to do so. 4, she says that it's in the best interest of China to do so because they get goodwill. 3 responses to this. First of all, the United Nations doesn't look kindly upon mass starvation inflicted by a country like China if it were to pull back the food aid. Number 2, the chances of China getting the Security Council that they're talking about, again, like that's not like there's no real like the Security Council power they're talking about, that just doesn't seem likely in the status quo. Number 3, again, we say China wants hard power in the region, not necessarily goodwill. Okay, so moving on to our case. So a couple things on the top before we move forward. So right now, let's look at what North Korea wants in the status quo. So number 1 is security, right? This is the most important thing for the North Korean leadership. And this obviously is the nuclear weapons program they think will guarantee them the security that they want. Number 2 is they want influence in the region. And number 3, unfortunately, is taking care of their own populace. So you have to consider the fact that security and influence will always come above number 3, which is taking care of their populace, which is why we put forward a counter proposition on the opposition side. We want, essentially what to happen is talks between the United States and North Korea to eliminate the proximity of the Pacific Fleet to North Korea. So this is training restrictions, maneuver restrictions on the 7th Fleet. So this is by far the biggest military asset in the region that North Korea fears. So this is a full-blown carrier group that continues to operate very close to North Korea. So what we want is international talks with North Korea to eliminate the immediate military threat to North Korea, because we think this is what continues to drive the desperation within the North Korean state. So we'll talk a bit more why that solves as we get into a positive matter. So our first point here is North Korean desperation and how their plan just continues to re-entrench it. North Korea is a rogue state, and they perceive any sort of action, international action like this, as a threat, obviously. Now, threatening North Korea means that they're always going to turn to more military action. This has been proven literally time and time again historically. It happens literally like every 2 or 3 years, where the international community thinks, and I'll get you in a second, that they can just ratchet up the pressure and get North Korea to do what they want them to do. But they have always responded, because they're a rogue state, by turning instead to military action and increasing their military. An example of this was the Kaesong industrial area. They ended up, so there was a lot of progress being made. They had this joint industrial plant with South Korea, then was closed, and North Korea immediately pulled back when there was some international response against their actions, and no progress was made. They'll always pull back and increase military action. Yeah?
As they say, the removal of the 7th Fleet will increase diplomatic relations. But as you've just said, they are a rogue state who is irrational and will not respond. The removal of the 7th Fleet will not make any valuable change.
But they're not entirely irrational. If you look to the hierarchy that I gave you right at the beginning, their number 1 priority is security, right? Which has to do with their nuclear program. They're afraid of other militaries or being able to sustain power. The 7th Fleet is the greatest threat to North Korean leadership. Nothing could remove Kim Jong-un from power quicker than a U.S. carrier group. So in this sense, we think pulling that back will give them a little bit of the space that they want. Alright, so what happens, the 2 things specifically happen when the North Korean regime becomes more desperate under their model. Number 1 is increasing military action, which is pursuing nuclear weapons as quickly or more quickly than they have in the past, so they think this is the key to keeping people away from them. Number 2 is nationalism. So as their people continue to starve and conditions continue to worsen within North Korea, we think this prompts this rally around the flag mentality, wherein the North Korean government continues to increase ideas of nationalism and push its people to rally around their leadership instead of actually making changes. So this then leads to starvation, right? There's no chance of a rebellion or anything like that in North Korea, and almost 100% of the population exists below the international poverty line. So at this point, you have mass starvation and the rally to the flag nationalism that just entrenches the problems. Number 2, China and its ulterior motives. So we think that China obviously has extremely imperialistic intentions within the South China Sea. It wants territory and or control. And we think that furthermore, like, human rights are unimportant to China. So if you look at their response to, for example, like the school collapse in Sichuan or like the industrial fire that they had recently, and the fact that they had no concern for improving safety requirements or even responding to the families of those killed, suggests that they have very little concern for the actual people. So any real Chinese response in North Korea we think might get the security impacts that they're looking for, but it probably won't do a whole lot for the North Korean people. It's actually in their best interest to have a powerful government, because North Korea provides for them a buffer zone between the major military power and U.S. ally South Korea, obviously, and their own border. So they always want the Kim regime to survive. So they want a surviving Kim regime, and they really don't care about the people. So thus, having China negotiate the terms, we think, means that China would have ulterior motives and probably won't get the best impact. So because we advocate for the North Korean people and affect the best change, we're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that fine speech. Now call the Deputy Prime Minister to give a speech on exceeding North Korea's #1 priority isn't security. It's to get back at South Korea. This is why. What happens when you try to get back at South Korea? You increase nationalism, you increase control, you increase patriotism. As they stated, North Korea is a rogue state, but because of the nature of its political system, because it is a rogue state, there is no way that they are ever going to listen to the United States. China is the only actor in play here, and the most important actor. So first I'm going to go into some rebuttal on what we just heard from opening, and then I'm going to go into my 2 new points. First, taking away North Korea's ability to harass South Korea, and 2, why food over nukes is important. And then I'm going to rebuild my partner's case. So first I would like to go into some rebuttal about what we heard in opening. So they state that, okay, this is going to push North Korea to greater desperation. They talk about black markets and loosening sanctions, but what actually happens when you give more aid to North Korea? As they said, North Korea is a rogue state. It's a military dictatorship. It is controlled from the top down. So what happens when you give more aid? This just increases Kim Jong-un's power because he is going to take that food and distribute it like this is something that he is responsible for, this is something that he is in control of, and ultimately it just increases the corruption and increases the power of the leaders, and we think this is a problem because it's not actually leading to any long-term change or stability, which is what we stated earlier. This is just a cyclical cycle of giving more food to North Korea distributing the food from top down, but not really giving the down that much food to begin with. So, they argue that it's going to increase starvation, but a nuclear war is going to decimate the population. Here's the reality. Every 3 months, North Korea has increased not only its military capacity, but its capacity for nuclear weapons. First it was radioactive uranium, then it was hydrogen bombs, then it was missiles, then there was like a self-induced earthquake that apparently North Korea made by testing their weapons. We think this is a huge problem, and no, I don't trust North Korea to just make empty threats, because if they do have the military capacity to attack South Korea, they will. Okay, so then they talk about how China has ulterior motives. China is not going to want to create a nuclear war. Period, right? China's economy is literally based on the United States. China pegs the U.S. their dollars, so the U.S. they can trade with the U.S. They talk about how China has adverse relations with other countries in Asia and Japan, but China is not going to want to aggravate these adverse relations in the threat of creating a nuclear war. China does not want to go to war with the U.S. This would decimate their economy. China is a communist country, but it's also very capitalist in the sense of how its economy works, and China's economy is its #1 priority. And this is just not going to happen. So yeah, North Korea is a rogue state and it doesn't respond to pressure, except for China. It literally shares a border with China. All of its political autonomy comes from China. Don't tell me that China can't pressure them. That is just not true. Then they say that they want these international talks with North Korea and the removal of the 7th Fleet. North Korea is not going to negotiate with the United States. They literally threatened to nuke us based off the interview with Seth Rogen. Like, why would they want to negotiate with us? This just doesn't make any sense to me. So, ultimately, I've said that why I don't think negotiation is a real issue here. And I don't think negotiation with the United States is going to be the solution either. China, the actor that is most in play here, both geographically and politically, has to be the one to pressure. So first I'm going to go into my new 2 main points now, which is taking away North Korea's ability to harass South Korea. So, When do countries go into conflict with other countries? They do this when countries are economically weaker. We can see this in many modern conflicts. For example, World War II, ISIS in Iraq, Taliban in Afghanistan, etc. Countries that are economically unstable are more vulnerable. Given the global economic instability, it is very likely that South Korea's economy is going to weaken. What is this going to encourage North Korea to do? North Korea's nuclear weapons are becoming highly developed, as I stated. I'll take you in a minute. They're becoming more highly developed over time, and it's a very rapid development. So, if South Korea becomes more weakened economically, this is just only going to encourage North Korea to attack. Because as we stated before, if North Korea has the nuclear capacity to attack South Korea, they will. If South Korea is economically unstable, they will attack. And now is the time that North Korea will have the capability of attacking, and we think that China has to put sanctions on North Korea right now to prevent this. Second, food over nukes. So, North Korea is a military dictatorship, right? What does this mean? Military leaders have the control of all the resources. It flows from the top down. Over 50% of internal revenue, as estimated by the UN in North Korea, goes towards weapons development, development of nuclear weapons, development of their army. What happens when China pressures North Korea? As we stated, China is North Korea's only ally, only political ally. Without China, North Korea literally has no political power whatsoever. They have no ability to get things that they need. They have no ability to get resources. They have no ability to maintain the power structure that they have been able to maintain in the past. They have no army compared to China, no international autonomy, and they will necessarily have to bend to China's demands in order to retain any sort of power and avoid destruction. So what happens when North Korea stops diverting its funds towards nuclear weapons? It's going to have to divert its funds elsewhere. This means that there are going to be more resources to the community, more resources from the top down. Even if you don't buy this, there's still going to be 50% of revenue that went somewhere that's going to have to go to somewhere else. Even if it's a small amount of diversion towards more people, it's better than nothing. It's better than going towards these weapons development programs, which is going to continue in the status quo unless China does something. And with that, I'll take back up.
Right. We don't buy any of this, right? A war with South Korea is not likely when U.S. is propping them both up economically and militarily. The anti-missile defense systems we have propped up against the border are going to destroy any nukes that North Korea can launch before they even get close to leaving North Korean airspace.
So I don't agree with this because North Korea's target doesn't necessarily just have to be South Korea. It can also be other allies of the United States as well. It could be Japan, it could be China, it could be very detrimental. So just because the United States has the military capacity to attack South Korea, what happens if they do attack them first before North Korea launches its nuclear weapons? China is probably going to go to war with America. This is going to be bad. We already have listed all these harms. We want China to be the actor that initiates in this case because we want to avoid a war of China versus the U.S. We want to avoid this conflict. And if the U.S. initiates this conflict, it's going to be the U.S. versus China, and this is something we don't want. So what did my partner tell you, and what points still stand? So we said, yeah, North Korea bad. Everybody agrees with that. They have human rights violations, nuclear proliferation. We believe that the best way to pressure North Korea into doing something is to go through China. China has the most political autonomy, it has the most international autonomy, and it has the ability to pressure North Korea to do these things. North Korea, as we said, will only listen to China. Second, China does not want a military conflict with the U.S. Why? Because, as we said, for the global economy, China has a manufacturing economy. It would be extremely detrimental for China to get into a conflict with the U.S. Backhalf points out that, oh, well, the U.S. has all these military capabilities. They can just destroy North Korea before they can even do anything. What happens in that case? China goes to war with the U.S. This is bad. We want the action to come from China. What happens if China creates action? This is going to create more cohesiveness and a more democratic sense of cohesiveness towards the human rights violations that occur in North Korea. China is part of the UN. China is on the Security Council of the UN. If China bends to the UN's demands, then ultimately they are going to be working more cohesively with more Western liberal democratic nations as a whole. And we think that this is a good thing for democracy, and we also think this is a good thing for the global community. So for that reason, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for that fine speech. We now call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to give a speech not exceeding 6 minutes.
One of the biggest myths in Western philosophy on the ability to deal with some type of dilemma dealing with security is that we need to continue to put pressure on the enemy to be able to get compellence. However, this has only proven throughout the entire Cold War to be the opposite and only lead to a security dilemma that leads to an arms race. All right, what we are proposing when we talk about this counter-proposal is that we actually involve concessions in the idea of negotiations. That for once, we actually look at what does North North Korea want, and how can we best get them to the table. And we'll talk about how historically this will be work in my positive matter when we talk about the security dilemma as my point of positive matter. But before that, let's get on some rebuttal. Now, right off the bat, they try and talk about in their last speech how North Korea is not characterized as having its #1 priority being security, but instead to get back at South Korea. Now, this is all proposed on the idea that they are a rogue state that want to get like some type of just get back at them for getting back at them, say, because of past harms. But this is not actually true. There's a conflation of ideas that occurs when people say the word rogue state and then assume that they are completely irrational. The leadership of North Korea is very rational as far as it considers itself to need to control power and be able to control security of its establishment. All right, this is a huge part of any rogue regime, actually, is it is usually characteristic of the leadership being extremely concerned about survivability and security. The biggest thing that North Korea, Kim Jong-un, and before him Kim Jong-il have ever complained about is the Pacific Fleet within their zone of strike. All right, they have always said that this is what they are trying to pursue nukes for, is because they are worried that the United States and South Korea will kill them. All right, they have always been concerned about this. However, there is a misconception when the front half tries to talk about how they would go in and immediately be the first one to strike into South Korea if they were to have nuclear weapons. That's essentially the main link that props up their new positive matter in their last speech. Now, why this is false is because they already have strike capability through conventional weapons to be able to wipe Seoul off the map with artillery. This is a real fact. The rest of, as back half points out, the rest of South Korea is pretty secure from our missile defense system right now. However, Seoul, due to conventional weapons, could be wiped off the planet in the next 3 hours. All right, this is a fact, and they haven't done it yet. This is not congruent with the argumentation that we get out of back half, not in rebuttal. So what we have to see here is, even if they get a nuclear, this is why a lot of military theorists have the idea that the pursuit of nuclear weapons for North Korea is for security reasons, for the regime's security reasons. So you can dismiss much of their argumentation, and which leads us into why this only adds on to the security dilemma problem and creates decades and decades of a mounting pressure that have been happening since armistice to possibly boil over because of an arms race. But before I get on, back half.
Yes. Now, they say that North Korea is only making nukes because of the 7th Fleet. That's the justification they give. But we think this is the same reason that, well, Bashar al-Assad only dropped barrel bombs on his people because they were getting too violent. You see, they'll say anything to justify that doesn't actually represent their ideals.
Okay, so we concede the idea that there is rhetorical, truth to what he's saying. But the matter of the fact is that there is, there is a misconception in Western philosophy that we can never give concessions and we will never get a good response. All right, this leads us into our point of positive matter where we talk about the security dilemma. All right, now in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the one thing that was the most successful were the concessions. That is what got tensions to stop. Is that we gave up missiles in Turkey and missiles in Italy. All right, and trade for them to de-escalate their nuclear program in Cuba. And we had U-2s even fly over. They allowed us to have essentially of the time inspections of U-2s being able to fly over. So we think that is very parallel because of the motives that Cuba had for getting weapons in their rationale for being in proximity to the United States. Now, why is this? It's because of a security dilemma. Cuba, like North Korea, was a rogue actor of its time. It saw the threat of the United States, just like North Korea saw the threat of the United States and South Korea to their security of their regime. They saw that they needed to get nuclear weapons because this was the ultimate form of being able to securitize their regime power. All right, this is extremely important. So, because they were able to secure these weapons, they felt secure. But the only way to de-escalate was to be able to offer concessions. We need a paradigm shift in this security dilemma situation, and that's what we offer you. Is we don't continue to mount pressure. All they will get is an arms race. Now, why is this? Because the security dilemma, in the idea of political science security dilemma, extends further than just the response of North Korea. There is also a response from South Korea and China and Japan and the United States. And what it follows the security dilemma is any amounting pressure and any amounting arms race that would come from a response would only allow for more of an arms race from the surrounding powers to be able to respond to that. And then where the dilemma comes in is because now that these surrounding powers have responded with higher escalation, now Korea would escalate with higher escalation. So you could see possibly more you could see more problems with the mobilization on the borders. All right. So next, we see this idea that what's key to be able to get rid of an arms race and a security dilemma in the modern time is to have communication. As they point out, China is their only communication network that they have. However, in their plan, they say get rid of any diplomatic ties. Get rid of any diplomatic ties and offer sanctions. So they essentially get rid of the one lifeline that is our only way out of the security dilemma and the only way out of an arms race that would reach the nuclear war that they are talking about here, that they are so worried about. All right. Next, you have to see that this response is real. The population of North Korea, at some point, they will have to respond to because they are literally taking away their food. They don't even contest that in their rebuttal. They understand that this will put pressure on them. Right? This is entirely why eventually you will see that you have this run to the flag mentality that Jack talks about, because now the people blame China. They see that China is the reason why they are starving, because before they were getting it. All right? So we are the only side that is able to offer an actual humanitarian response, because we understand that we need to have some type of change. We do need to de-escalate North Korea's nuclear program. We do need to make it so that we don't have this DMZ problem. But the only way we do this is we follow something similar to an identical case study of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and since tensions are so high, we actually act first and have some level of concessions. Thank you.
Thank you, that fine speech. We now call the member.
The government side believes that North Korea has been coddled. We believe that they've been coddled by the bamboo curtain that is China's complicit nature, and that the only true solution to this issue is to expose North Korea to the chilling wind that will be international politics once they no longer have China's support. We do not believe removing the 7th Fleet will do anything, but rather it will simply give North Korea more leeway to do whatever they want. We must here make a stand, we must take away the support of China, we must make a meaningful change in the lives of people in the whole South Asian region. So now we'll move on to some extemporaneous points of rebuttal, and then we'll take you to a meaningful extension where we will show you why Chinese solidarity with the United States and the Western world will help to influence North Korea's actions, and we will give you specific examples as to how this has worked in the past. Now let's go on to the issues of North Korea's wants, because they gave us some great wants there. Now they told us first that North Korea wants 3 things in this order: security, influence, and taking care of the people. And they stated that, look, okay, we know that North Korea may seem unreasonable, but they're partially reasonable because look at the 3 lists they have, right? The first thing they want is security. And we say, well, I don't really know where you get that list from, and I don't know why we would believe that list. Because if someone is just looking for security, you don't threaten to blow another country off the face of the map. You don't threaten to launch nuclear missiles when you're just trying to defend yourself. When you're trying, if maybe they were just trying to get nuclear, no, not at this time. You see that if they were being threatened at any point, and then they threaten this, we can see that. But when you make unwarranted threats, we do not say that as an act of trying to be secure. We see that as an act of instigation of violence. You don't agree with that?
The misconception of the bamboo curtain is huge. The relationship is actually at its highest strength. All right, it has actually been compared to the relationship between Russia and China in 1969, which actually reached an outbreak of essentially conflict.
Okay, I don't exactly see how that ties in. What we're trying to show is that China is still giving the aid to North Korea, and it's protecting them from what will actually happen once you remove their aid, and we'll show you that later on. So what we want to show you with the North Korea wants, right, is that first of all, it just doesn't make sense that what they really want is security. But even if you do buy that what they really want is just to be secure from the West, what we do isn't to just remove the 7th Fleet. What we do is to increase the diplomatic ties, right? To make sure they're safe, because there are political barriers that prevent war from happening in everywhere else in the world. It actually isn't just to remove one fleet, because that doesn't actually remove any of the threats they have. That removes one threat. The move is to increase stability in the entire region, so they don't need to worry about anything. Either way you look at it, their plan fails. And that's where we need to look at the counter-proposal. They talk about the 7th Fleet. And they say that what North Korea wants, more than anything, is the 7th Fleet to go. They say that the regime has said this. And we think that, as I used the example of Bashar al-Assad in my POI, as Rouhani and Ahmadinejad before him said that all they want is nuclear power plants for energy, as Donald Trump says he just wants to make America great again, you cannot trust the rhetorical devices of people who are trying to convince people of outrageous ideals. So we do not take that as a reason to actually go with the 7th Fleet ideal, but rather what we implore you to do is to use logic. What we must do is show North Korea that their actions are not okay by any means necessary. The next thing they talk about is that how Kim Jong-un is a buffer zone. And China has ulterior motives because they feel the need to keep having that country. And we could actually see this as making some sense, right? It's a good job. But now here's what I'm thinking, okay? Is that if you really want a buffer zone, the best thing to have is to keep that regime in power, but to increase diplomatic relations. If China is to actually help North Korea get up from this situation, that is going to how you're going to have a good buffer. That is how you're going to build long-term support. And now we're going to keep going on. Where in the last speech we saw this talk of we're going to have anti-Chinese sentiment propagated. And we really don't think that when you're talking about North Korea, about the Kim Jong-un dictatorship, that what we're going to talk about is what the people are going to think from international ties. We're talking about a dictatorship that tells them that Kim Jong-un, on his first time playing golf, scored a hole-in-one on every hole out of 18. Okay? We're talking about a dictatorship that tells its people that he was born inside of a bird's nest. Okay? We're telling a dictatorship that fills its people's lives with propagandas where there are actual radios in their houses that non-stop play propaganda music. We're telling you that they're not going to know what China is doing. What they're going to know is that their dictatorship is failing them even more than it ever has because those people have been propagandized, but what they will feel is the actual thing. And we believe that it is tough, that life is going to be so hard for them. But we believe we will never have a solution and life will never get better there if you do what they're saying. Now the last thing we need to talk about is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now we want to tell you that this is not the USSR. This is not the USSR backing up Cuba. This is not the same level of tension we have, and this analogy is simply inept. Now we're going to go on to talk about our valuable piece of extension, which is why showing Chinese solidarity with the United States will help to ease relations. We see that North Korea right now knows that they have the support of China, both at least with helping their people, and at least with some aspects of China just have some similar motives, which we see. What we need to do is show North Korea that they have no more allies. They have no one that will protect them. Because this is how we get them to come to the bargaining table. When they know they have an option, they're not going to bargain with us because they simply don't want to. They'd rather nuke us, they'd rather nuke Japan, and they'd rather nuke South Korea. When they have no other option, then maybe we can actually get the negotiations. And we believe that if we open up, if China shows that they are going with U.S. ideals, if they are doing things like we saw at the opening half, where they are ameliorating the tensions we've seen between South Korea and North Korea, if, as we will show you, how in the South China Sea the actions taken by China will be ameliorated because they're helping the U.S. interests now. If China shows that they are aligned with U.S. ideals, we show North Korea that they no longer have their full support. We see similar acts of diplomacy being used in the Vietnam War, where Nixon went to China, where he made highly politicized and publicized movements, and that scared the North Vietnamese armies into thinking that China may pull their support, that China was not fully in the fight. This helped us to reach a decision when North Korea was almost ostensibly destroying us in the war. This is why we got to have a peace agreement. We see that by showing North Korea that they no longer have a backup, we do a similar thing. We scare them into thinking they have no other options in the region. We show them that the dictatorship will fall because they no longer have the support of one of the strongest countries in the world, that is China, in any way. We show them that the entire world, community is against them. And that we show them that we are willing to work with them, and we are willing to make the change, but they must first do something meaningful. They must first take down the arms, the nuclear arms that they have done. They must decrease the threat they pose, because as they have stated, they are a rogue nation, and not one that we can simply negotiate with until valuable changes are made. For the reasons we have shown you, we strongly urge a government ballot. Thank you.
All right. Member of opposition.
I kind of generally like operating in reality, so I'm going to explain why none of this would ever happen in reality and what's actually going to happen when we have China strong-arm North Korea into this. What we're going to see is this plan will almost certainly cause China to forfeit a valuable strategic position as this more like quasi-mediator ally that it currently holds, and where North Korea, we currently can manage the threat. They're going to evolve into a threat that we can no longer manage, right? Backing them into the corner isn't going to say, oh, well, they're going to go and, automatically come to the table, right? 70% of their country is in famine, and they still turn away aid from Western allies because they don't want that type of influence in their country. So I'm going to talk about two unique points in this round. I'm going to talk about cultural nuance and why proxemics and consideration of these are important when considering allies. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about China's current role in stealth multilateralism and why we prefer status quo over anything they prefer. But first, some extraneous rebuttal. First of all, nuclear war as an impact, quite frankly, is ridiculous. They can point the gun, but they're never going to be able to shoot this. This is just reality, right? Anti-missile defense systems are going to take care of this. But even if they do get nuclear, and they do manage to develop a weapon that can launch a nuke, China is currently the only actor that can talk them down from the ledge. Yeah. Forcing China into a position where they strong-arm North Korea will merely agitate them more and they'll sever ties to China. That's a problem. Secondly, even if North Korea managed a military offensive, a China-US war, the ultimate impact coming from opening government, is absolutely ridiculous because Chinese-US trade is far more valuable to both these nations than North Korea as a political pawn, right? China will definitely kick North Korea to the curb if it came down to, well, we can either keep propping up the Kim regime or we can continue trading with the US. They're going to continue trading with the US. So that deals with opening government. I even gave them the best case scenario, right? Secondly, what we get from closing government, a lot of rhetorically infantilizes North Korea. We need to treat them as an important actor, not some child that needs to be punished. First of all, because this punishment is not going to work in the first place, right? And you spent a lot of time challenging North Korea's desire for security. You said that if they really wanted security, they wouldn't be threatening to bomb people. U.S. does the same thing. Does the U.S. not want security? Right, this type of thing is absolutely ridiculous. You need to tell me how strong-arming an approach that the U.S. employed and North Korea decided to then isolate itself from the U.S. is going to somehow make North Korea come to the table with China. No, they're just going to merely do the same thing that they did with the U.S. and cut ties with China. No, thank you. Right? We don't see this as beneficial in any stretch of the imagination. So let's talk about cultural nuance and why this is important when determining how North Korea will actually respond to this kind of pressure, because that's really what we need to impact. We think that North Korea will wholly reject any kind of strong-arming pressure that China will engage in, right? The type of strong-arming pressure that the U.S. has already tried. Why? North Korea is based on a culture, right? Their entire regime is propped up on propagating a certain culture. That culture is based on 3 North Korean principles: Jushi, Shaji, and Shawi. What these principles are, yes, that's a real thing. I didn't make it up. Right? These are actual cultural principles, and what they entail is the principles of sovereignty and the importance of maintaining a North Korean identity, absence of Western influence. If China takes the same approach that North Korea does, what you're going to do is then see lump China into now a Western influence, and they're going to reject it. This is why they reject Western influence. This is why they tear off American labels off of food aid packages. This is why in 2004, right, there was a long stretch of time where the only helicopters they would allow in to come drop food aid packages were Chinese ones, because they didn't want Western influence and they saw Chinese as a non-Western ally. If you make them take this Western approach, you're really going to have them overtly try and leverage North Korea to the point where North Korea is just going to cut them off. 70% of their country lives in famine and they still turn away aid. This proves that their principles, their cultural principles, are far more valuable to them than anything they can take away from them on this side of the house. We think that the best way to leverage North Korea into a manageable situation, a manageable rogue state, because there is a difference between a rational rogue state and an irrational rogue state, which we think you get on their side of the house, right? We think that the best way to do this is to utilize covert, right, clandestine efforts that China currently employs as a quasi-ally of North Korea. That's China's current role and how it employs stealth multilateralism as opposed to overt strong-arming. And I'm going to explain why that's important, but before I do, go ahead back.
Yes, now they're not rejecting Western food aid because they want people to become less Westernized. They're not trying to have cultural integrity. They're rejecting Western food aid because they're trying to convince their people that the Western world is no better than what they are doing for the people themselves. They want to convince them that the regime is not necessarily the worst thing possible when it is.
Right, so they try and demonize the West, saying the West is the worst thing possible, and they don't want that influence in their country. That's what this is, right? They want to keep out Western influence. That's this whole idea. This is why they refuse to participate in Olympic Games and things like that, because they see that as a source of Westernization. That's important to weigh in this round, right? You're going to make China seem like a Western person to them, and then they're not going to want to negotiate with China whatsoever. You don't get any of the solvency on your side of the house. So let's talk about China's current role and why this is much preferable in keeping North Korea manageable, right? Their current role is that they're this moderate ally where small concessions can be made. China is the country that led six-party talks, that we got types of concessions that benefited the world, that kept the nuclear program in check when North Korea kicked out the IAEA, right? When they did that, when we didn't have any international body, we had China lead six-figure talks that caused them to dismantle their one light water reactor in Yongbyon, right? This only came about when China led these talks as a moderate actor, not a Western influence. They don't want the westernized UN, IAEA in this country trying to tell them what they wanted to do. They preferred China because China was an ally to them both culturally and they were not Western, which is important, right? What they'll do when you force China into this position of westernized approach, the Western approach to this problem, North Korea is ultimately just going to cut China off in the same way that they cut everyone else off. What this is going to cause is a decrease in transparency about what's actually going on in North Korea. Think like insight that we have access to via China right now, because China has interest with the U.S. So like through transitive property, like we are able to see what's going on in there, right? And you're also going to get increased humanitarian harm because they're not going to have food come in at all anymore, right? This is a problem, right? There's a humanitarian concern that we need to weigh out in this round. And we don't think that dangling food aid above a starving group of people is principally or morally sound, but it's also not going to lead to a more effective approach to this situation. We prefer a status quo where we have a more stealth multilateral approach. We're trying to act as this middleman that can talk down North Korea from the edge in case they do become too radical, right? We lose this valuable position as a global community that China currently holds when we force China to take the Western approach to North Korea. And this means that it's more likely North Korea will evolve from a predictable and manageable rogue state to an irrational and unmanageable rogue state, more likely that you'll have an increase in death toll within the borders, more likely that you'll get the military offensive that they're so afraid of on government side. We recognize that you don't get any universal good, right? North Korea is still a rogue state, but we see on our side of the house when we maintain China's current role as this moderate actor, this quasi-ally, and not a westernized approach to North Korea, we're going to prevent the most loss of life. We recognize that there's going to be certain humanitarian harms, but we do the best job at preserving what shred of good exists in North Korea and keeping them as a manageable state. They fail in this criteria for all these reasons. Proud to oppose this motion.
Okay, government what?
Madam Speaker, we say that closing opposition accused us of treating North Korea like a childish actor. But the reality of this debate so far is that we treated them with a greater degree of sophistication when considering how they would respond to Chinese association with Western ideals and with the U.S. We treated them like adults and with more sophistication when we told you that even if they valued security and we gave opening government everything they wanted, everything they wanted, that they wouldn't achieve the kinds of goals that they want to. So we think that on our side of the house and at closing government, we've provided you new material about how we achieve change in North Korea and how we do affect the regime. But second, that we're going to deal with the things that opening brought you. So 2 points of clash then in my speech. One, I'm going to quickly deal with the countermodel by opening and tell you why they no longer are in this debate. Second, I'm going to talk about why we achieve change and why that's something that we get on our side of the house as opposed to what closing wants to tell you. So one, opening, opposition. They gave you a countermodel that we need to remove the 7th Fleet, and they said that it was wise for the United States to make concessions. However, what we think this does, and something that opening government didn't tell you, is that it empowers the ability of the dictatorship within North Korea to spin narratives about that dictatorship, right? Because at the point where the West is making a concession without getting anything in return, which is what they told us, right? We need to remove the 7th Fleet. Even if we give them what they want in terms of North Korea valuing security, if you think about what happens, if the West and if the United States retracts their 7th Fleet, it allows Kim Jong-un and his dictatorship to tell the people with the propaganda that has been so consistent in this debate that he has won, right? That he's got a huge concession from the West, that he has power over America because he's made them retract one of their military fleets. So we think that that doesn't really work out when you think about security, right? That concession was never reasonable, and we tell you on our side of the house that it empowers the narrative and the patriotism that they thought we got.
That's why that model doesn't work, because it doesn't actually change the propaganda that dictator is trying to propagate, right? It empowers it. Moreover, we think that when they talked about priorities, if you think that North Korea values security over how much it wants to destroy South Korea, that our side is actually better, right? Because when China, and what I told you, when China is associated with the US, and when China leaves its ties with North Korea, that creates a fear that North Korea is no longer secure, right? So in the best case scenario for opening opposition, we still don't think that their case works, rather it empowers narratives. So that's that done. Next, let's talk more importantly about how we achieve change in North Korea and how we're going to win this debate because of it. No thanks. What Austin told you was that when China cuts ties with North Korea, what it does is it creates the impression in the upper levels of North Korean dictatorship that China is allying or adopting Western ideals, right? That's what it does. It tells them that China is no longer willing to support them, but is willing to support the United States and that ideology of superpower that North Korea hates, right? What does that do? We think that that inspires fear, not in the lower levels of the North Korean people, right? But that inspires fear in the upper levels that control propaganda and that control the dictatorship and that control the quality of life for people in that state, right? We don't think that that was childish analysis because it engaged with the fears and the different incentives that play upon the people who run that country. What did we hear in response then? We heard that this is going to be similar to when North Korea cut off ties with America because America tried to strong arm them. The reason that we think this is different is a pretty obvious one, right? China is their last political ally. When America tried to strong arm them and they were still able to maintain a healthy relationship with a superpower like China, we say it was easier for them to cut off ties with the US and to effectively hate them, right? But at the point where this is the last diplomatic relationship and the last economic relationship with a superpower that North Korea has, we tell you that the way they act will be different to that last instance. So that's why what the previous speaker said about them acting the same way this time is different, because the scenario and the circumstances are inherently different, right? So when those things are different, the way that Kim Jong-un acts will also be different. Yeah.
Right. The entire power structure in North Korea, the entire reason the regime is in power is because they reinforce these cultural ideas. When you have China take a Western approach, i.e. become West, that is an affront to these cultural ideas. They're going to sever those ties regardless of what harms, regardless of if it's the last ally.
No, but we don't think that they're going to sever ties with China because of that kind of thing, right? We think that when China becomes more Western, they are more likely to appeal to China and to acquiesce to the demands that they're going to be making. And that's what the next part of this point of clash, right? Why are they more likely to acquiesce to demands than to presumably go to war? Because that's what you're saying is going to happen, right? We think that what you heard from closing was that when North Korea associates China with Western ideals, they'll sever ties with China. We think that is inherently bad, not only for the people in North Korea, but for the dictatorship itself and the regime. Why is that? Because alongside giving humanitarian aid, we think that China also provides a number of economic benefits to North Korea, which are good for the dictatorship and the regime itself. That's why North Korea is going to be incentivized in the back half of this debate to actually acquiesce to demands that China makes. And if you think about why that's the case, it's because they are afraid of going to war with superpowers, right? What did we hear about war? We heard that they're never going to be able to go to war or do any meaningful damage because US defense missile systems will shoot down any nukes. We think that regardless of whether they actually cause damage, right? At the point where they try to start a war, at the point where they do fire a nuke, and let's say it doesn't hit anywhere in South Korea because it's shot down, that's still an act of aggression that's not going to go unresponded to by China and the United States, right? So that is something that's going to actually start conflict, even if we give closing what they want, right? That it'll be shot down by US missile systems. That's why, in the closing half of this debate, we think that North Korea is more likely to take our route, right, which is engage with some of the demands that China is making, so that it isn't forced into a situation that is unfavorable for it, and that's unfavorable for the interests of its dictatorship. No, thank you. So, and what else did we hear on the point of change, which we think was the most important point from back off? We heard that cultural values in North Korea are things that are going to make sure that they adhere to the path of war, right? But I think we've already proven with the response to the previous point as well, that cultural values and the values that tell North Korean people that they need to idolize the Kim regime are the exact kinds of forces which are going to create discussion and meaningful concessions from North Korea with China, right? That's a point that works for us because at the point where the dictatorship itself is the one being threatened by the economic sanctions, and the point where the dictatorship is the one whose security is threatened, we think that that dictatorship is likely to make changes in the way that it engages with superpowers in the world. So what have I told you in my speech and what has closing done in this debate? We think that at closing we've dealt with the model from opening and shown why that's something that's never going to achieve the harms that they said. Rather, it propagates harms that they thought were on outside the house. But more importantly, we have dealt with North Korea in a sophisticated manner, right? We've talked about incentives that work not only on the power structure, but on the people as well. We've talked about the cultural factors that closing wanted. And at the end, we told you that association, the analysis that stands at the end is association of China with the West is something that is likely to create meaningful discussion and, more importantly, concessions from North Korea. The impacts we get at the end of our case are safety for the South Korean people, more discourse with North Korea, more of an ability for China to negotiate with them, and that's why we're proud to propose.
Before previewing my questions, what I think this round can be adequately summarized to, I want to reemphasize one thing to us all, and that is the standard that we should be weighing this round with. What party ought we be providing for, i.e., the people of North Korea and basically the rest of the world? I think this was kind of accepted throughout the round, except for the weird lens of China out of opening government. But I think in the rest of the debate, we kind of agreed that we should care about North Koreans. We should also care about the stability of the rest of the world. Now, with that out of the way, I have 3 questions. Number 1, what is the best way to enact change? Great clash with the last speaker. Number 2, why this radicalizes North Korea? And number 3, why is China's current role uniquely valuable? Before that, I'm going to do some direct rebuttal to the new ideas we got out of the gov, which were pretty good. We'll start with the first one, how somehow we are empowering North Korea to spin narratives. We have 2 responses to this. This isn't directly to opening opposition's plan. Regardless if the plan works or not, we have 2 responses. Number 1, we say they spin narratives anyway, regardless of what happens, so I don't know if that's a unique benefit. And then number 2, we think that the narratives that they're going to spin will be worse when they can say, look, the West poisoned the mind of China. That's probably going to be a lot worse than the narratives we have on our side. But then he goes on to say this: the GovWhip agrees to Westernization impacting in favor of against the upper echelons of North Korea. So we have a response to this too. If anything, these upper echelons are so invested in the image of North Korea, they hold the 3 principles that Tanner gave you so dear that the upper echelon are less likely to change, like the government whip would have you believe. And so when he tells you that they're going to acquiesce, we have 2 responses to that as well. Let's remember that opening government thought they were irrational. So when the Gov Whip says that the economic benefits of China will sway them, we say, number 1, nice subtle knife, and number 2, they close market interests. They deny food for free, by the way, on the basis of these principles. I don't know how you can get any more economically irrational than that. We don't think there's any basis to the claims he's making. And he ends his speech with a dictatorship being threatened, and somehow it's going to equal change. Tanner gives analysis on why the dictatorship only doubles down in that scenario. Let's review that analysis right now. What is the best way to enact change in North Korea? Now, we all accept that North Korea needs to be de-radicalized, which will help both parts of our standard, the people of North Korea and the stability of the world in general, right? Now, our honorable opening team provided a counterplan, which was cool. That's literally all I'm going to say about that. Now, but I like to point out, though, that despite them doing a fine job of defending the benefits of their model, Tanner applies more macro, nuanced analysis and explains the best way not to get only opening opposition's honorable plan, but also any kind of progress in North Korea, any kind of concessions. But before explaining the best method, he offers the only analysis on why North Korea is so rooted in its rejection of Western values. And Tanner then explains how China's increasing pressure would be viewed as a Westernizing factor. The big bad China would become part of the West. Now, Tanner gave you 3 cultural principles and how those are the best predictor for how North Korea will react. We think you should give him credence for that because we don't see the same predicting evidence out of the government bench. And I think this is important because he not only gave you examples of food labels and heli drops, he even gave you the example of the Olympics. I think all of these give enough empirical evidence to show how North Korea is likely to react. Now let's talk about why this particular mode of action only serves to radicalize North Korea. Now, opening opposition explained how North Korea isn't totally irrational, and we agree, but Tanner explains the until portion missing there. Let me explain. They are somewhat rational until they are backed into a corner where they don't have the homie China to talk them off the ledge, right? Isolationist states employ aggressive international policy when they lack the alternatives that hegemonic states are privileged with. I think this trumps the member of government's analysis that assumes that North Korea operates on a zero-sum game. Like Kim will say to himself, well, I guess China isn't picking up the phone, I have to go play with the United States. Tanner already explained to you how that's not how this works. Just because China isn't willing to deal with North Korea doesn't mean that North Korea is going to take any alternative. They are more likely to double down, become more isolationist, and not engage in these policies. That shows a more radicalized North Korea. Go on.
You say that China is going to be able to talk North Korea off the ledge, but you don't give us any analysis as to how that's going to happen. At the point where there's no consequence for North Korea, if they say no to those demands, why won't they go through with it anyway?
Okay, so I'll reference that in two ways. Number one, your opening government team, one of their arguments was North Korea listens to China. And number two, we show you already through Tanner's analysis how, the Rebuttal reactor was done because of the six-party talks which China was instrumental in. And also we will tell you in my last point, and I'll flag it for you, why China is uniquely valuable. But before then, we want to turn opening government argument about North Korea being a credible threat to our side. Because even if we take them at their best, which Tanner was willing to do, where North Korea is a credible nuclear threat to the world, then more than ever we need to listen to the fact that we don't want them to be radicalized. Now let's talk about why China is uniquely valuable in response to that point of information. Now we see a sweeping, factual mischaracterization of China's current role in North Korea development all across the government bench, right? Opening and closing government are, of course, more than happy to gloss over the fact that China has been unique in attaining concessions from North Korea. China gave us the six-party talks after the IAEA Western influence that they would tell you as a solution was booted from the table, which resulted in the water reactor being shut down, which resulted in nuclear disarmament from North Korea. We see these things happen when they have an ally that is willing to engage with them on a more not westernized principle, I guess is the best way to put that. Status quo, we're seeing that being degraded when China is taking more aggressive policy. This is the point here. Now, even the PM's arguments agree that North Korea listens to China, as I just said. Now, Tanner gave you the harms of a radical rogue state, like the deaths of the North Koreans, who are absolutely, as they agreed to, going to suffer when you don't have North Korea with any sort of ally. People are going to die. They're dying status quo. It's only going to get worse. But I think we also impact the idea of North Korea radicalizing being really bad for the entire world. If we listen to what opening government told us, where they're a nuclear threat and they have the capability to enact harm on not just South Korea, but other states as well, then more than ever, we don't want them to be isolationists. I think we need to refer again to Tanner's analysis of them not being isolationists being the best way to enact change in North Korea, which brings me to the final comparative with a minute left in the round. I think when we do a comparative of these two worlds, right, we have an option which is more likely to radicalize North Korea, which is more likely to not only show that China's current role is not worth anything. We're going to lose all the benefits of China's current role. But lastly, it will lead to no change in North Korea for the foreseeable future. I think if we're talking about progress for North Korea, which is something they really wanted to get, they needed to do a better job of showing how that progress would be attained. If anything, I think we gave good predictive evidence for why North Korea will not enact change in the future, and why they will be radicalized, and why China has current benefits. For all those reasons, I think I've done my job. I'm proud to oppose.